Most people are defeated not by what is done to them, but by what they say. There is a particular kind of damage that only language can cause damage done, not by enemies, not by circumstances, not by misfortune, but by your own words, offered at the wrong moment to the wrong person in the wrong emotional state. The argument that escalated because you couldn't stop at the true point and kept going past it. The secret shared because the silence felt too heavy to carry alone. The frustration expressed because the pressure of not expressing it had become unbearable, and in that moment of release, something that could never be taken back entered the world and changed it permanently. You know what this feels like, not as an abstraction, as a specific memory, probably more than one, that visits you in quiet moments with the particular quality of regret that belongs only to things you did with your own hands and your own voice, freely, without anyone forcing you. Every one of those moments had a door, a moment where the words had not yet been spoken and the choice had not yet been made. And on the other side of that door, the door you didn't take, was silence. Silence that would have cost you nothing and preserved everything. Arthur Schopenhauer understood the door. He wrote about it with the precision of someone who had stood in front of it many times, had sometimes passed through it and sometimes not, and had spent decades of philosophical reflection understanding the difference between the outcomes on each side. He was not a naturally silent man. He was passionate, opinionated, sometimes volcanic in his private contempt for ideas and people he considered beneath serious engagement. But he believed, with increasing conviction as he aged, that silence was among the most sophisticated and most powerful instruments available to a thinking person. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understands precisely what saying things costs. This video is about that understanding, and it will change the way you inhabit every conversation, every conflict, every room for the rest of your life. Let's begin where the real damage lives, in the specific anatomy of what happens when you speak too soon, too much, or from the wrong interior state. The most common version is the argument. You are in a conflict with a colleague, a family member, a partner, a person who has said something that activated everything in you that knows how to be activated. The point you want to make is real, the grievance is legitimate, the facts are on your side. And so you speak clearly, forcefully, with the passionate precision of someone who has logic and justice behind them. And the argument does not resolve, it escalates. Because the other person was not waiting for your point. They were waiting for their turn to speak. And your perfectly formed argument has provided them not with new information that might change their position, but with new material to counter, new angles to attack, new evidence of your emotional investment in the outcome that they can use to question your objectivity. You gave them your whole hand, and now they are playing against it. The second version is the disclosure. Someone invites your confidence. You share something real, something vulnerable, something you would not have shared without the invitation and the apparent warmth that surrounded it. And the information travels not necessarily with malice, not necessarily with intention, to places you did not authorize and in forms you did not choose. The confidence you shared has become a data point in other people's understanding of you, available for interpretation, available for use, impossible to retrieve. The third version is the justification. You did something, or you want something, or you hold a position, and you explain it in such thorough and preemptive detail that the explanation itself becomes the target. You have done the work of your critics for them, identifying every vulnerability, addressing every possible objection, demonstrating through the very thoroughness of your defense exactly where you feel exposed. The explanation that was supposed to close the conversation has opened it wider, and the openness now belongs to whoever wishes to walk through it. Schopenhauer observed all three of these patterns with the unsentimental clarity that was his intellectual signature, and what he saw beneath all of them was the same root, the compulsive human need to be understood. This need, he believed, was one of the most reliably self-defeating forces in human life. It drove people to speak past the point of usefulness, to share past the point of safety, to explain past the point of dignity, because the alternative, being misunderstood in silence, felt more unbearable than the real risks of speaking. The need to be understood was so strong that it consistently overrode the judgment that assessed whether the current moment, the current listener, the current emotional state was appropriate for the communication being prepared. We speak, Schopenhauer argued, not primarily because we have calculated that speaking will produce the desired outcome. We speak because we cannot bear to hold what we know, what we feel, what we need to express, inside ourselves alone. We speak because silence, in a moment of strong feeling, feels like suppression, like we are doing violence to our own interior by not giving it voice. But here is the hard distinction that Schopenhauer wanted us to understand. The feeling that silence is suppression is almost always wrong. Silence is not suppression. Suppression is the denial of the interior state, the refusal to acknowledge what you feel, the performance of a calm you do not possess. Silence is simply the decision not to express the interior state in this moment, to this person, in this form. The feeling still exists. The knowledge still exists. The grievance, the insight, the desire, none of these things are destroyed by silence. They are held. And the person who can hold them without being compelled to release them at the first available opportunity is a person operating at a fundamentally different level of power than the person who cannot. Here is where the weapon reveals itself, because silence, genuinely practiced rather than simply performed, changes the structure of every interaction it enters. When you speak less, what you say carries more weight. This is not metaphor, it is a direct consequence of scarcity. Information is valued in proportion to its rarity. The person who speaks constantly produces a signal-to-noise ratio that makes it genuinely difficult to distinguish the important communications from the reflexive ones. The person who speaks selectively and deliberately creates, over time, an expectation that when they do speak, it matters. Their words land in a different way, with a weight that is not about the words themselves, but about the track record of the speaker. Schopenhauer described this in terms of the conservation of intellectual energy, the idea that the mind, like any system, operates with greater precision when it is not constantly expending itself. The person who thinks before speaking, who allows an idea to fully develop in the interior before expressing it externally, consistently produces communication of higher quality than the person who processes aloud, who discovers what they think by saying it, who revises their position in real time in front of whoever happens to be listening. Processing aloud has its place. In genuine intimacy with people who have earned the right to your unformed thinking, it can be a beautiful expression of trust. But in most situations, professional, social, competitive, conflicted, it is a liability. It reveals the seams of your thinking, the moments of uncertainty, the places where the argument hasn't fully assembled itself yet. And those seams are available to anyone who wishes to pull them. Silence, by contrast, conceals nothing you need to reveal. It gives you time. It gives you the luxury of presenting the finished thought rather than the construction process. And, in presenting the finished thought calmly, without defensive qualification, without the anxious filling of space, you communicate something about the quality of the mind behind it that no amount of articulate processing aloud could achieve. Let's examine a specific domain where silence functions most precisely as a weapon: the conflict. Every conflict has a rhythm. There is an escalation phase where energy increases, where positions harden, where each communication produces a counter-communication of slightly greater intensity, like an auction, where both parties keep raising and neither is willing to be the last bidder. Most people enter this phase automatically, matching the energy in front of them, because matching feels like engagement and non-matching feels like surrender. But silence during the escalation phase is not non-matching, it is interruption. When the expected counter does not arrive, when the argument you made is met not with a rebuttal but with a pause, a considered silence, the quality of attention that belongs to someone who is genuinely processing rather than preparing their response, the rhythm of the conflict breaks. The other person, calibrated to escalation, suddenly has nothing to escalate against. Their energy, which was building in anticipation of resistance, has nowhere to go. This produces one of two outcomes. Either the other person continues to escalate into the void, which rapidly makes them appear unreasonable to any observer, and, eventually, to themselves, and people do not maintain positions they can hear themselves sounding unreasonable in defense of. Or the escalation collapses of its own weight, the energy dissipates, and the conversation drops to a register where actual communication becomes possible. In neither outcome have you conceded. You have not agreed with the other person's position. You have not performed calm over a turbulent interior. You have deployed calm as a strategic instrument, one that restructures the emotional terrain of the conflict without a single word of argument or defense. Schopenhauer wrote that the person who responds to passion with passion has lost already. Not because passion is always wrong, but because passion meets passion on the other person's chosen terrain, the emotional, the reactive, the heated, which is precisely where the person who initiated the escalation is most skilled and most comfortable. The silent response refuses that terrain entirely. It forces the conflict onto a different ground, one that the silent person has chosen and the escalating person was not prepared for. Let's now look at silence in its most precise and most underestimated form, the silence that follows a question. Most people treat questions as things to be answered immediately, as if a pause before the response is itself communicative of something embarrassing, some inability to answer, some uncertainty that ought to be hidden, and so they answer quickly, before the thought is fully formed, before they have assessed whether this question deserves the full answer they are about to provide, or whether the full answer is even what the moment calls for. The person who pauses after a question, who allows a genuine, unhurried silence to exist between the question and the response, does several things simultaneously. They signal that the question is being genuinely considered rather than reflexively answered, which is a form of respect for the question, regardless of how they ultimately choose to engage with it. They give themselves the time to decide not just what they think, but whether they want to share what they think. With this person, in this context, at this level of depth, and they create, in the asker, the quiet anxiety of uncertainty, the not knowing of what is coming that is almost always more productive for the questioner's respect than any immediate, confident answer. The immediate answer tells the questioner exactly where they stand. The pause tells them nothing, except that the person across from them is not operating on autopilot, is not giving them the reflexive response, is taking this seriously enough to actually think about it. Schopenhauer identified this as the asymmetry of revealed interiority. The person who speaks fills the room with information about themselves. The person who listens and pauses gathers information while revealing almost none. Over the course of any sustained interaction, this asymmetry compounds dramatically. The talker has handed the listener a detailed map. The listener has given the talker a closed door. And the person holding the map is not, in any meaningful sense, the more powerful person in the room. There is a form of silence that is perhaps the most powerful of all, and it is the one that most people never consciously practice because it requires a level of self-possession that is genuinely difficult to develop. The silence in the face of provocation. You are insulted, dismissed, publicly underestimated. A person says something about you, to you, or in front of you, or in a room that reports back to you that is designed to diminish, to wound, to provoke the kind of response that would embarrass you or reveal you as someone who can be moved by their words. The expected response is the response they have designed the provocation to produce. The anger, the defensive explanation, the attempt to correct the record, the escalation that confirms you care that you have been reached, that their words landed somewhere important and produced the intended disruption. In producing that response, you confirm the power of the provocation and invite more of the same. Silence in this moment is not passivity. It is the refusal of a gift they were counting on you to accept. It says, without a word of communication, something more devastating than any clever response could. You are not a significant enough event in my life to disrupt my composure. Your provocation has found nothing to provoke. Schopenhauer wrote that to dignify an insult with a passionate response is to acknowledge it as meaningful, to suggest that the person who delivered it has the standing to evaluate you in a way worth contesting. But the person who has built their sense of worth on an internal foundation does not need to contest the evaluation. They simply do not accept it. And in that non-acceptance, expressed not through argument but through the quietest, most absolute silence, they remove the entire mechanism by which the provocation was supposed to function. The provocateur is left in a room alone with their provocation. There is no resonance, and a provocation with no resonance is simply noise. Let's look at this through a historical example that illustrates the full power of this principle at the highest possible stakes. Abraham Lincoln, during the years of the Civil War, received a volume of criticism, abuse, and public provocation that by any ordinary measure would have been intolerable. He was called incompetent, cowardly, physically grotesque, morally bankrupt in newspapers, in political speeches, in the whispered conversations of his own cabinet, some of whose members believed they were better suited to the presidency than the man occupying it. Lincoln did not respond to most of it. Not because he was unaware he read the newspapers, he knew what was being said, he felt the weight of it in ways he documented privately, but he had developed, through some combination of temperament and philosophical necessity, an extraordinary capacity for selective silence. He chose his engagements with the precision of a man who understood that every response was itself a communication about his own stability, and that the most powerful communication he could make was the one that demonstrated his stability was not contingent on the world's approval. He wrote letters in response to provocations, detailed, forceful, sometimes devastating letters, in which he said everything that needed to be said about what had been done and what he thought of it. And then he did not send them, he sealed them, set them aside, and returned to the work. The letters exist in the archive as testimony to the discipline, evidence that the silence was not the absence of thought but the considered, deliberate containment of it, held until the moment of its expression could be chosen rather than driven. That discipline, the capacity to fully form the response and then choose not to deploy it, is the most sophisticated expression of silence as power. It is not suppression, it is mastery. Now, let's talk about what silence reveals, because one of its least discussed functions is its diagnostic capacity. When you stop filling space with words, other people fill it. And what they fill it with is information you could never have obtained through direct questioning, information about their anxiety level, their need for your approval, their relationship to uncertainty, their assumptions about what your silence means and what it permits. The person who is comfortable in silence with you is the person who is comfortable in themselves. They do not need the silence filled because their sense of security does not depend on continuous confirmation from the social environment. Silence between you is not a problem to be solved, but a texture of the relationship, evidence that presence can exist without performance. The person who is uncomfortable in silence with you will begin, almost immediately, to talk. And in talking, in the words that rush to fill the space your silence has created, they will tell you things they did not intend to tell you. Their fears about how they are being perceived, their assumptions about what you're thinking, their need to manage the ambiguity of your unspoken response, their anxiety about whether the relationship is intact, the negotiation is going well, the dynamic is what they thought it was. Schopenhauer would have found this diagnostically fascinating, the idea that silence functions as a kind of social solvent, dissolving the performances that people maintain when they feel the constant pressure of reciprocal communication and revealing the actual state of the interior beneath. Most people, when given enough silence, will eventually show you exactly who they are. Not because they want to, but because the alternative, maintaining the performance without the feedback of your engagement, becomes untenable. Your silence, in this function, is not a weapon pointed at them. It is a mirror. And mirrors, for people who are not used to being observed without comment, can be among the most unsettling things in any room. There is a philosophical dimension to silence that goes beyond strategy, one that Schopenhauer believed was essential to any genuinely examined life. He wrote extensively about the noise of the world as an obstacle to genuine thought. The constant stimulation, the relentless social demand for performance and response. The way that modern life, even in the 19th century, before the amplification of everything that has followed, conspired to keep human beings permanently on the surface of their own experience, never quite descending to the depth where real understanding lived. Silence, in this reading, is not a tactic or a weapon. It is a practice of self-return, the daily, deliberate withdrawal from the world's demand for your engagement, creating the interior space in which your actual thinking can occur rather than the reactive, surface-level processing that passes for thought in the pressure of constant stimulation. The people who have produced the most enduring ideas, the most significant work, the most genuine contributions to human understanding almost universally, they describe a practice of sustained, protected silence at the center of their creative life. Not silence as the absence of sound, but silence as the condition of genuine interiority, the space where the mind stops responding to external inputs and begins generating from its own resources. This is the deepest form of silence as power. Not the silence deployed in conflict or negotiation, but the silence that makes you, over time, a fundamentally different kind of person, denser, more self-contained, less dependent on the continuous stimulation of the social world for your sense of vitality. More capable of the patience that genuine achievement requires, because genuine achievement, in almost any domain, requires the willingness to hold what you are building inside you, unseen and unvalidated by others, for longer than is comfortable. Let's bring this home into the specific, daily situations where this practice makes the most immediate difference. In your next difficult conversation, notice the moment when you want to say more than the situation requires. Notice the pull to explain, to justify, to elaborate beyond the point where elaboration is useful. And in that moment, practice the pause. Not a loaded pause, not a performance of withholding, simply the genuine experience of holding the thought for one more breath before deciding whether it needs to enter the room. In your next conflict, notice the moment when the other person's energy is escalating and your instinct is to match it, to bring your own argument to the same temperature, to prove that you are not less passionate than they are, less invested, less serious. And in that moment, choose the lower register, choose the quieter response. Let your composure be the argument not for their position, but for yours. The argument that says, I am someone whose position does not require heat to hold. In your next provocation, notice the moment when the clever response forms the perfect, precise, devastating thing you could say that would make the point and make it undeniably. And then notice what it would cost you to say it, the escalation it would invite, the confirmation it would provide that you can be reached. The way it would move the conversation from the terrain you chose to the terrain the provocation was designed to produce. And then hold it. Let the clever response exist in you, fully formed, as evidence of your own thinking. And let the silence carry what the words would have tried to carry, but with less cost, with less risk, with the particular authority that belongs only to the person who had something to say and chose not to say it. Schopenhauer, in his later years, achieved a silence that was not strategic but essential, not the silence of someone withholding, but of someone who had genuinely arrived at a place of interior sufficiency that no longer required the continuous confirmation of external expression. His ideas were formed, tested, refined, and present in him with a completeness that made their public articulation feel less urgent than it once had. He still wrote, he still argued, still criticized, still engaged the world with his characteristic intensity. But beneath the engagement, there was a stillness that his earlier life had lacked, the stillness of a person who knows what they know and no longer needs the world to confirm it at every turn. That stillness is the destination of this practice. Not quietness as a personality, not the performance of mystery, not the strategic silence of someone calculating what to withhold, but the genuine, earned, inhabited silence of a person who has so thoroughly developed their interior life that the world's noise, its demands, its provocations, Its invitations to speak when speaking serves no purpose, simply does not reach them in the same way anymore. You are building that stillness. Every time you hold the unnecessary word, every time you choose the pause, every time you let the provocation land on a surface it cannot penetrate, every time you inhabit the quiet rather than rushing to fill it, you are building, brick by invisible brick, the interior architecture of a person who cannot be easily moved. And a person who cannot be easily moved is, in any situation, the most powerful person in the room. Not because they are louder, not because they are more articulate, not because they have more to say, because they have less to prove. And less to prove is the quietest, the oldest, and the most absolute form of strength that any human being has ever possessed.